Imagine you're on a long flight from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing on a beautiful night. You've completed all the flight procedures and are ready to arrive in mainland China the next morning. But what if one day, the flight time suddenly becomes longer than expected? Not just a few hours, but 9 years. Sounds absurd, right? Yet, this is the true story of MH370, the most mysterious missing plane in aviation history, an indelible scar in humanity's collective memory. 9 years have passed, thousands of theories have been proposed, millions of dollars poured into the largest search efforts ever. But the result remains a resounding zero. Did this giant aircraft truly crash into the deep ocean? Or was some terrorist force indirectly behind the disappearance? Or have we been deceived all this time about its fate? Everything has reached a stalemate, leaving the world and the families of 239 passengers in unbearable sorrow. How did this event unfold? What theories have been put forward to explain this enigmatic disappearance? And more importantly, can we ever find a definitive answer? All will be revealed in this video. But before we delve into the mysteries, we kindly ask you to take a few seconds to hit the subscribe button and share to support our team, and to not miss out on our future quality content from Primitive Universe. Now let's join us on the journey to uncover the truth about MH370. Please like and subscribe to my channel. Please comment what you want to suggest to me. That will be the motivation for me to make videos every day. Thank you very much. Now let's get back to the topic. Is flight MH370 really missing or just a stage drama? The fateful moment. It was March 8, 2014, at Kuala Lumpur International Airport. A flight was preparing for takeoff. It was Malaysia Airlines flight MH370, scheduled to depart at 0:41 a.m. and arrive in Beijing at 6:30 a.m. the same day. Leading the flight crew was Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, 53 years old, one of Malaysia Airlines' most senior and respected pilots. Alongside him was First Officer Farid Hamid, 27. A promising young man just one training flight away from receiving his full certification. They led a crew of 10 flight attendants and 227 passengers from various countries, mostly Chinese nationals. Everything proceeded completely normally, from the boarding process to takeoff. For the first 40 minutes of the flight, nothing unusual occurred. At 1:19 a.m., MH370 reached the boundary of Malaysian airspace. Air traffic control in Malaysia informed the flight they were handing it over to Ho Chi Minh City Air Traffic Control in Vietnam. Captain Zahari responded with a "Good night, Malaysian 370, forgetting to repeat the frequency. However, this wasn't considered unusual. Pilots occasionally omit this minor detail. Everyone thought the flight would smoothly pass through Vietnamese airspace and arrive in Beijing on schedule. Yet, what followed became history that no one could have anticipated. The captain's good night was the last signal ever heard from this doomed flight. Just seconds after entering Vietnamese airspace, MH370 vanished from civilian radar screens. This was certainly an ominous sign. Air traffic control personnel made frantic efforts to contact the aircraft, but received no response. At this point, military radar was used to search for MH370's location. Strangely, the aircraft had abruptly turned from its northeast course to Beijing, heading west across the Malay Peninsula towards the Indian Ocean. MH370 then left the range of military radar at 2:20 a.m. Just 1 hour after takeoff, the aircraft had completely lost contact with air traffic control. What happened next was prolonged confusion for both air traffic control and the airline. News of MH370's mysterious disappearance spread rapidly. Authorities scrambled to search for the aircraft by all means possible, while families of the passengers waited anxiously in Beijing. They couldn't believe that their family members wouldn't be coming home. Everything happened too suddenly. Would a large-scale international search commence? Where exactly did MH370 go? The endless search. As soon as the seriousness of the situation was realized, search operations were initiated. According to reports, the last known confirmed position of the aircraft was 122 nautical miles off the east coast of Kota Baru, Malaysia. Weather conditions that day were excellent, yet the aircraft disappeared without any warning or distress signal. It was truly bizarre how the giant metal bird, MH370, had simply vanished. Malaysia collaborated with Vietnam to conduct a series of joint search and rescue missions for the missing flight. The search area was expanded to 50 nautical miles from the aircraft's last known position, including the Strait of Malacca. Many other countries also joined the search operation, such as the United States, Singapore, the Philippines, and especially China, the country with the most victims on this flight. There was no sign of MH370. Therefore, the search area was further expanded. The Malaysian government then decided to increase the search radius to 100 nautical miles to cover a larger area of the Gulf of Thailand between Malaysia and Vietnam. In the weeks following MH370's disappearance, search efforts focused on Southeast Asian waters, and an investigation into the disappearance was launched. Malaysian authorities asserted that the aircraft continued to fly for several hours after losing contact with air traffic control. It's possible the aircraft followed one of two arcs extending northwest into Central Asia or southwest into the Indian Ocean. However, the northwest arc was ruled out due to insufficient evidence. The focus of the search then shifted to a more remote area, unrelated to the flight path from Malaysia to Beijing, the southern Indian Ocean. On March 18, 2014, a search was launched in this region, led by Australia. Yet, there were no signs of a plane crash, no debris was found. Everyone was despairing. Less than a week later, on March 24, 2014, the Malaysian Prime Minister announced that flight MH370 had ended in the southern Indian Ocean with no survivors. This conclusion enraged many, especially the families of the passengers and crew. But under pressure from public opinion and the victims' families, many other search operations were conducted with the participation of numerous organizations and countries. A faint hope and deep disappointment. 6 months after the mysterious disappearance, the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, ATSB, organized an underwater search in the Indian Ocean. The organization mobilized all the most advanced search equipment available at the time, including autonomous underwater vehicles, AUVs, to scan the ocean floor. In April 2015, Australia, China, and Malaysia decided to expand the search area by an additional 60,000 square kilometers, bringing the total search area to 120,000 square kilometers. The search area was concentrated in the southern Indian Ocean along the 7th Arc, located 2,500 kilometers off the coast of southwestern Australia, extending down to the area between latitudes 33 and 36 degrees south. The ATSB based its search for the ill-fated aircraft on the ghost flight theory. This method posited that with pilot input, the aircraft could glide for an additional 100 nautical miles after running out of fuel. However, this argument contradicted Inmarsat satellite data, which suggested the aircraft plunged nose first at a speed of 4,570 meters per hour at the time of impact. Ultimately, these extensive search efforts within the 120,000 square kilometer radius yielded no trace of MH370. This search incurred costs of over 180 million Australian dollars, with China contributing 20 million. Just when everything seemed to hit a dead end, a discovery brought considerable hope to the search teams and the victims' families. Objects identified as debris from MH370 were found drifting ashore on Reunion Island and the East African coast. This raised questions about the accuracy of the initially identified search area. Although the recovered samples were few, they were enough to offer a glimmer of hope to the world at that time. Through examination, French and Malaysian experts confirmed them to be part of MH370's wing and interior. Leaders of the three key nations were optimistic about finding the main wreckage of MH370 in the southern Indian Ocean. The recovered samples were also sent for testing to determine if they belonged to the passengers on the flight. However, there wasn't enough conclusive evidence to definitively prove their connection to the ill-fated MH370. Thus, the family's agonizing wait continued, growing increasingly desperate. Search methods were also modified to quickly pinpoint the aircraft's actual location. Australia, Malaysia, China, and other related nations jointly decided to launch an underwater search in the ocean depths. However, to achieve this, an extremely difficult problem had to be solved: how to determine the exact area where the aircraft crashed. This required pinpointing the time of the course deviation and the flight distance until fuel exhaustion. This was truly challenging, as both factors were vague and lacked concrete evidence. In this search for MH370, a group called the Independent Group also participated. This was a network of about 20 individuals, including pilots, scientists, engineers, and experts from various countries. They came together out of a shared interest in unraveling this greatest aviation mystery in human history. Controversial theories. For over 2.5 years of searching, the independent group collaborated several times with the Australian Transport Safety Bureau in the search efforts. However, these two organizations disagreed on assessing the precise moment MH370 turned south. Arguments erupted, and despite numerous theories, none brought conclusive results. These large-scale and extremely costly search operations completely failed. No one could definitively state where MH370 was. Why was this the case? Answering this question isn't easy, as the search area was limited within the vast expanse of the open ocean. However, there were unforeseen shortcomings in the search operations. No one can definitively pinpoint the main cause of these failures. But to some extent, one could argue that the search agencies of the Australian Transport Safety Bureau and the Malaysian host nation had deficiencies. Australia's then Transport Minister, Darren Chester, stated that human efforts have limitations in a search considered a test of human capability, expertise, and scientific technology. He himself admitted that with limited data in the initial months after the aircraft disappeared, the Search Coordination Agency made some errors in determining the aircraft's departure direction. This led to wasted time and lost opportunities to find significant evidence and data. Furthermore, the slow cooperation and the Malaysian government's absolute secrecy regarding flight data also made the search inefficient. Indeed, the host nation was unwilling to share data about the ill-fated MH370. This not only angered participating countries, but also infuriated the passengers' families. They organized protests demanding the government release full information so that the victims might have a chance to be found. It must be said that it was an extremely turbulent and stressful period for Malaysia and the countries involved in this operation. However, the mystery remains a mystery, with no explanation for this aircraft's disappearance. But how could an aircraft as large as MH370 vanish without a trace? If it truly crashed into the sea, wouldn't debris and the black boxes have been found? Many theories have been proposed, each with certain arguments, but generally lacking concrete evidence. What caused MH370 to crash and become the greatest mystery in human aviation? All initial suspicions focused on the ill-fated flight's captain, Zahari Ahmad Shah. He was believed to have intentionally crashed the plane, committing suicide along with the passengers and crew. According to a report by The Atlantic, The captain transmitted a signal indicating the aircraft had leveled off at over 10,000 meters. An aviation expert also drew many inferences supporting this theory. William Languiush suggested that Captain Shah might have taken control of the aircraft and deliberately brought all passengers and crew on board to their deaths with him. Shah could have rapidly depressurized the cabin, increasing the aircraft's altitude to over 12,000 meters. This would cause those in the cabin to lose consciousness within minutes and eventually die without gasping for air. It's believed this was because the oxygen mask system couldn't be used for extended periods. When pressure suddenly increases or decreases, masks are activated for passengers to breathe. However, they are only effective for about 15 minutes when the aircraft is at an altitude of around 4,000 meters. At an altitude of 12,000 meters, this backup measure would be completely ineffective. This implies that passengers and crew would have died before the plane crashed into the sea. MH370 had become a plane full of corpses, but there was one person who didn't suffer from oxygen deprivation to death: the captain. He could have used an oxygen mask for many hours and calmly controlled the plane from the cockpit. Furthermore, before MH370 took off, the captain was the one who requested fuel for the aircraft. The estimated flight time from Kuala Lumpur was only 5 hours and 37 minutes, but Shah requested enough fuel for 7 hours and 31 minutes, meaning the plane could fly for an additional 2 hours. This would allow Captain Shah to fly to the most remote areas of the Indian Ocean. Why would Shah request extra fuel if he didn't intend to fly the aircraft to another area to commit suicide? Another discovered detail further fueled belief in this theory. Captain Shah was a supporter of the Malaysian opposition and knew its leader, Anwar Ibrahim. However, just one day before MH370 took off, Ibrahim was sentenced to 5 years in prison. It's easy to speculate that this might have prompted pilot Shah to act. There were reports that MH370 circled for about 22 minutes to negotiate Ibrahim's release. It seemed the two sides couldn't reach an agreement, so the captain decided to fly the plane to the furthest part of the southern Indian Ocean. A flight simulator was also found at the captain's home. This would be perfectly normal for pilots to practice their skills, but Shah's simulator had been used to chart a flight path to the southern Indian Ocean. Isn't this too coincidental? Information from the flight simulator suggested the possibility that the captain himself had plotted a suicide plan. However, this was still considered insufficient evidence to confirm what happened on the night the plane disappeared. Tony Abbott, former Australian Prime Minister, also stated that top Malaysian officials believed MH370 disappeared because the pilot deliberately crashed the plane. In response to Abbott's comments, then Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak denied it. He agreed that Malaysian officials had considered this possibility, but did not officially disclose their stance. This was because it would be unfair and legally irresponsible, as the black boxes and cockpit voice recorder had not been found. Regardless of the arguments, Shah remained the prime suspect for the aircraft's disappearance. Nevertheless, the assertion that the captain was the main culprit received some criticism from the public. Some argued that the captain was a man at the peak of his career success, with over 18,000 flight hours. When the pilot suicide theory lacked sufficient evidence, people considered another possibility. A pilot shared his thoughts with Chris Goodfellow of Price Goodfellow, who had over 20 years of experience in the aviation industry. He suggested that fire might have erupted in the cockpit due to an electrical short circuit. In such a scenario, the pilot's first reaction would be to cut circuit breakers until the faulty circuit was isolated. At that point, the aircraft would stop transmitting data to air traffic control. Perhaps there was a fire in MH370's cockpit that caused such a serious accident that the pilots had to concentrate all their efforts on controlling the aircraft. Therefore, contacting air traffic control was no longer the top priority. If this truly happened, It would easily explain why the aircraft suddenly changed course instead of heading to Beijing as scheduled. In a panic, Captain Shaw decided to find the nearest airport to land. Goodfellow also asserted that experienced pilots always know the nearest airport on a route for emergency landings. Pilots might also increase the aircraft's altitude to 13,000 meters, where the oxygen density in the air is lowest, to extinguish the fire. However, at this altitude, it's very difficult to keep the aircraft stable, even if the captain was highly proficient in controlling it. Therefore, the possibility of the aircraft stalling could occur. This would cause smoke in the cockpit, making the pilots pass out, and the aircraft would continue to fly until it ran out of fuel and crashed into the Indian Ocean. If this were true, Captain Shaw tried to save everyone but simply ran out of time. But wait, this argument sounds plausible, yet it's still not entirely convincing. It doesn't explain why the captain requested extra fuel for the aircraft. In fact, in 2014, fuel prices were quite high, so planes only carried enough for their intended use. And Goodfellow himself found no definitive evidence to support his theory. Due to this loophole, the cockpit fire theory still receives some criticism. If it wasn't pilot suicide or a fire, what could have been the cause? At the time, the possibility of MH370 being attacked by terrorists was not ruled out. Malaysian officials stated they investigated and discovered 2 suspicious passengers had used stolen passports. These 2 individuals purchased tickets through China Southern Airlines, a codeshare partner with Malaysia Airlines. They used documents belonging to an Austrian and an Italian national, who had previously reported their passports stolen in Thailand in 2012 and had sought police investigation. Typically, only smugglers or illegal immigrants use fake identification. However, there wasn't enough evidence to definitively claim that these 2 passengers with fake passports were terrorists. They could have been thieves or simply bought passports on the black market. A former member of the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board involved in the search also shared some information. The inability of the pilots to make an emergency call indicated that the plane might have exploded due to depressurization or been destroyed by an explosive device. The incident must have occurred very quickly, preventing any contact. It's possible that an organization or group of people seized control of the aircraft, forcing MH370 to crash into the southern Indian Ocean. Combined with the captain's request for an additional 2 hours of fuel, many believed that everything had been pre-planned. This theory shares many similarities with the 2006 terrorist plot, where terrorists intended to bring down a plane over the Atlantic using liquid explosives. It's hard for people not to consider this theory. According to a 2012 report by the U.S. State Department, Malaysia was a country vulnerable to terrorist activities. It was considered a transit and planning hub for terrorism. However, Malaysia had not experienced any serious terrorist incidents in those years. Others noted that the plane disappeared at the end of the annual session of China's National People's Congress in Beijing. At this time, China was also facing increasing terrorism concerns, so it's conceivable that someone might have planned a terrorist attack on a flight primarily carrying Chinese passengers. Nevertheless, no official link to terrorism was ever established, and no organization claimed responsibility for the MH370 incident. Therefore, the possibility of this ill-fated aircraft being a victim of a terrorist attack remains pure speculation. Supernatural theories and lingering pain. Scientific arguments alone aren't enough to satisfy everyone. And so, as if by natural progression, more mystical speculations about MH370 emerged. From a positive perspective, many believe MH370 fell into a time warp. Why positive? Because in the past, there was a story of a plane that disappeared and returned 37 years after its disappearance. Indeed, it's the story of a flight from New York in 1955 to Miami that landed at an airport in Venezuela in 1992. The man believed to be the sole witness to this strange event was Juan de la Corte. On May 21, 1992, Juan was working in the air traffic control tower at Caracas Airport as usual. Suddenly, a Pan American DC-4 aircraft landed at the airport and contacted Juan for assistance. At first, he didn't notice anything strange, but after communicating with the pilot, Juan was utterly astonished. The aircraft, flight number 914, was en route from New York to Miami and had been flying for 2 hours. On board were 57 passengers and 4 crew members. Yet, the aircraft had not appeared on radar screens. Looking down at the runway, he found it even stranger. The aircraft looked quite old, a type common in the 1930s-1940s. Both Miami and New York were very far from Venezuela, about 1,600 miles. Therefore, Juan worried that the aircraft had lost its way. As for the pilot of Flight 914, upon hearing the airport name Caracas, he was utterly bewildered and reconfirmed that the plane was expected to land in Miami at 9:05 a.m. On July 2, 1955, Juan continued to realize there were too many anomalies here. He also informed them that this was an international airport in Caracas, Venezuela, and the date was May 21, 1992. When airport staff began to approach the aircraft from 1955, the pilot refused and chose to depart. Everyone at the time recounted seeing passengers on Flight 914, pressing their faces against the windows, looking at everything with curious eyes. This strange incident was reported by Venezuelan air traffic control staff to the airport management. An investigation was launched, but all matters led to a dead end, and no evidence was found. To this day, no one knows where that plane came from, whether it truly disappeared in 1955 and traveled through a time warp to 1992. Many still question whether this is a tall tale or something that actually happened in Venezuela. This story of a plane traveling through time, in a way, helps us consider a more positive possibility. What if one day MH370 suddenly reappears in the airspace of some country with all its passengers and crew intact? Everyone would be safe, reunited with their families and loved ones, and the aircraft would be unharmed, not crashed into the sea. At that moment, the greatest mystery in human aviation history would be solved. This ending is much more beautiful than any of the scientific theories presented. 9 years have passed, and information about the Boeing 777, flight number MH370, remains too vague. The plane's wreckage has not been found, and the fate of its victims remains the greatest unsolved mystery in aviation history. The families of the passengers and crew have endured unspeakable pain. They worried, panicked, and were terrified to witness their loved ones vanish without being able to do anything. Hope would rise, then fall into disappointment, followed by fear. Thousands of emotions have tormented the victims' relatives and friends. However, there's a greater fear in their hearts, and in many others around the world, that MH370 will gradually fade into oblivion, and no one will speak of this ill-fated flight again. Global public opinion has moved on, is moving on, and will continue to move on from the tragedy. Humanity's interest is no longer focused on MH370. Only they, the families, are still waiting for the victims in vain. This man has experienced that profound pain and loss. Ghislain Wautrelos, a French engineer. His wife and 2 of his 3 children were believed to have perished, along with other passengers on flight MH370. Like other victims' families, Ghislain doesn't know what happened to his wife and children because no debris was found to confirm their deaths. No bodies were ever discovered. For a long time, Ghislain lived on hope and faith in the government's search efforts. He once hoped that the plane might have made an emergency landing on one of Indonesia's 16,000 uninhabited islands, or had been taken hostage somewhere. However, he also had to accept that he seemingly had no chance of seeing his wife and children again. More than that, he felt even more afraid of the public silence. Everything had become the past. and no one wanted to revisit this mysterious yet heartbreaking disappearance. The world moves past the past to continue forward, but for people like Ghislaine, the fear and pain simply cannot fade. In the end, MH370 could not be found despite many theories and expert involvement. All human efforts and technological advancements yielded no results. The ill-fated aircraft, along with 239 people, seemed to vanish from the world. Perhaps the captain himself committed suicide, taking the passengers with him. Perhaps there was a terrorist attack that forced MH370 to crash into the southern Indian Ocean. Or perhaps the aircraft strayed into a time warp and will return one day.